In the grand halls of Avalonia Palace, where golden tapestries tell stories of a 1,000-year dynasty, a single letter would prove more powerful than any sword ever wielded by the royal guard. What began as an ordinary Tuesday morning in the kingdom of Avalonia would end with a decision that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy, leaving some hearts broken and others elevated to heights they never imagined. The letter, written in elegant script on cream parchment, contained words that would force King Edmund to choose between the woman he loved and the son he believed could save their crumbling kingdom. The morning mist still clung to the palace gardens when the messenger arrived at the gates of Avalonia Palace, his horse's hooves echoing against the ancient cobblestones like thunder in the early dawn. Sir Marcus, the head of palace security, watched from his tower window as the rider dismounted with unusual urgency, clutching a sealed envelope against his chest as if it contained the secrets of the universe itself. King Edmund sat in his private study, surrounded by towering bookshelves filled with the wisdom of ages past, when the knock came at his door. At 62, the king had weathered many storms during his reign, his once dark hair now silver at the temples, his face bearing the lines of countless difficult decisions. He had ruled Avalonia for 28 years, through prosperity and hardship, always with Queen Cordelia by his side. "Your Majesty," Sir Marcus announced as he entered, his voice carrying an undertone that made Edmund look up from the trade agreements he had been reviewing. "A letter has arrived. The messenger claims it comes from the Council of Noble Houses." Edmund's hand paused over his morning tea. The Council of Noble Houses rarely communicated directly with the throne unless matters of grave importance were at stake. These were the ancient families that had supported the monarchy for generations, their loyalty as valuable as the gold that filled the royal treasury. The letter felt heavier than its physical weight as Edmund broke the royal seal, the wax crumbling between his fingers like the certainty he had felt just moments before. As his eyes moved across the elegant handwriting, his face grew pale, and the hand holding the parchment began to tremble almost imperceptibly. The letter spoke of growing unrest among the noble families, of whispered concerns about the future of the kingdom. Queen Cordelia, though beloved by Edmund, had never been fully accepted by the old aristocratic families. Her commoner origins, despite her marriage into royalty 15 years ago, remained a source of tension among those who believed royal blood should only mix with royal blood. More troubling still were the paragraphs that followed, detailing economic concerns and political pressures from neighboring kingdoms. The nobles feared that Avalonia's influence was waning, that their trading partners viewed the kingdom as weakened by internal divisions. They spoke of Prince Alexander, Edmund's son from his first marriage to the late Queen Isabella, as the symbol of traditional strength the kingdom needed. But it was the final paragraph that struck Edmund like a physical blow. The nobles presented him with an ultimatum disguised as a request: choose Prince Alexander as his immediate successor and step aside from active rule, or face the possibility of the noble houses withdrawing their support from the crown entirely. They gave him 1 month to decide. Edmund set the letter down on his mahogany desk and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. Below, he could see Queen Cordelia tending to her rose bushes, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight as she worked. She moved with the grace that had first caught his attention all those years ago when she served as a diplomat's daughter at a state dinner. Their love story had been the stuff of fairy tales, or so it had seemed. A widowed king finding happiness again with a woman whose intelligence and compassion had won his heart completely. But fairy tales, Edmund was learning, often collided harshly with political reality. Prince Alexander appeared on the garden path, his tall frame and confident stride marking him clearly as royal-born. At 35, he possessed all the qualities the nobles admired: military training, diplomatic experience, and the unquestioned legitimacy that came from being the son of Queen Isabella, whose noble lineage traced back to the founding of Avalonia itself. Edmund watched his son approach Cordelia in the garden, saw the polite but distant greeting they exchanged. There had never been open hostility between them, but neither had there been the warmth of a true family bond. Alexander respected Cordelia as his father's wife, but the 15-year age gap and the circumstances of their meeting had prevented any deeper relationship from forming. The king's mind raced through the implications of the noble's demands. Choosing Alexander would mean acknowledging that his marriage to Cordelia had been a political mistake, that love had clouded his judgment in ways that now threatened the kingdom itself. But refusing the noble's request could lead to civil unrest, economic instability, and the possible collapse of the very monarchy he had sworn to protect. As Edmund continued to stare out at the garden, he realized that the letter had not just arrived with the morning's correspondence. It had arrived at the end of one chapter of his life, and the beginning of another, one where every choice would carry consequences he could barely begin to imagine. The weight of the crown, which he had worn with pride for nearly 3 decades, suddenly felt unbearably heavy upon his head. In the distance, church bells began to ring the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the kingdom like a call to prayer, or perhaps, Edmund thought grimly, like a funeral dirge for the life he had known. 3 days had passed since the letter's arrival, and King Edmund had managed to keep its contents secret, though the effort was taking its toll on him. His usually hearty appetite had diminished, and Cordelia had begun to notice the way his eyes seemed to focus on some distant point during their conversations, as if his mind was wrestling with problems she could not see. Queen Cordelia had always prided herself on her ability to read people, a skill that had served her well during her years as a diplomat's daughter and, later, as queen. She could sense the shift in the palace atmosphere like a change in weather, subtle but unmistakable. The servants whispered more quietly in the corridors, and even Sir Marcus seemed to carry himself with unusual tension. It was while organizing Edmund's study, as she did every Thursday morning, that Cordelia discovered the letter. It had been placed between the pages of a historical volume about the kingdom's founding, clearly an attempt at concealment that spoke to Edmund's troubled state of mind. Her hands shook as she read the elegant script that spelled out what felt like a death sentence for everything she held dear. The words blurred before her eyes as the full impact hit her. The noble houses wanted her removed from influence, wanted Edmund to step aside in favor of Alexander, wanted to return to the old ways where bloodline mattered more than character or ability. She had always known that some viewed her as an outsider, but seeing it laid out so formally, so coldly, felt like a knife to the heart. Cordelia sank into Edmund's leather chair, the same chair where she had sat countless times while they discussed kingdom affairs together. She had never sought power for its own sake, but she had worked tirelessly to use her position to improve conditions for the common people of Avalonia. Her literacy programs had brought education to remote villages, her trade initiatives had strengthened relationships with neighboring kingdoms, and her charitable foundations had fed thousands during the harsh winter 2 years past. But none of that seemed to matter to the noble houses. To them, she would always be the commoner who had dared to marry above her station, the woman who had disrupted the natural order of things simply by capturing a king's heart. The sound of footsteps in the corridor made her quickly fold the letter and place it back in its hiding spot. When Edmund entered his study moments later, he found her standing by the window, her posture rigid with barely controlled emotion. "Cordelia, my dear, I didn't expect to find you here," Edmund said, though something in his voice suggested he was not entirely surprised. Perhaps he had unconsciously wanted her to discover the letter, wanted to share the burden he had been carrying alone. She turned to face him, and he could see immediately that she knew. The careful composure she maintained in public had cracked, revealing the pain and fear beneath. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her eyes. Edmund closed the door behind him and moved toward her, but she stepped back, needing space to process what she had learned. 3 days, he admitted. "I've been trying to find a solution, some way to satisfy the nobles without abandoning your wife," she finished, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Without admitting that marrying me was a mistake that threatens your precious kingdom?" "You are not a mistake," Edmund said firmly. But even as he spoke the words, they both could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. Not doubt about his love for her, but doubt about whether love was enough to overcome political reality. Cordelia walked to the bookshelf and pulled out the volume that had concealed the letter, holding it out to him like evidence in a trial. "They want you to choose Alexander. They want you to step aside and let him rule while I what? Disappear quietly into obscurity? Accept exile with grace and dignity?" Edmund took the book from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a gesture that once would have been comforting, but now felt like goodbye. "I won't let them dictate to me," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "There has to be another way." "Is there?" Cordelia asked, and the question hung in the air between them like a challenge. "Your nobles control the army, the treasury, the trade routes. If they withdraw their support, what happens to Avalonia? What happens to the people we've both sworn to protect?" The silence that followed was filled with the weight of impossible choices. Edmund had always believed that leadership meant finding solutions where others saw only problems. But this situation seemed to offer only painful compromises and devastating losses. Alexander doesn't even want the crown yet, Edmund said finally, grasping for any reason to delay the inevitable. He's never expressed interest in taking power early. Cordelia's laugh was bitter. Do you think that matters to the nobles? They see him as a symbol, a return to the old ways. Whether he wants the responsibility or not is irrelevant to them. She moved away from him again, pacing to the far side of the room as if distance could somehow lessen the pain of what they both knew was coming. I've always known this day might arrive, she said quietly. I've always known that loving you might not be enough to protect what we've built together. Edmund watched his wife, this remarkable woman who had brought such light into his life after years of loneliness following Isabella's death, and felt his heart breaking. The choice before him was not just between political stability and personal happiness. It was between the woman he loved and the kingdom he had sworn to protect, between his own desires and the good of the hundreds of thousands of people who depended on his leadership. Outside the study windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the royal guard's changing shifts echoed through the corridors. Life in the palace continued its ancient rhythm, unaware that the very foundations of their world were shifting beneath their feet. Prince Alexander stood on the balcony of his private chambers, watching the sun set over the kingdom he might soon be called upon to rule. The news of the noble's letter had reached him through Sir Marcus, who had felt it necessary to prepare the prince for what might be asked of him in the coming weeks. The revelation had left Alexander feeling as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted, transforming familiar territory into something uncertain and treacherous. At 35, Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for eventual kingship, but eventual had always seemed comfortably distant. He had served as a military officer, led diplomatic missions, and studied governance under the finest tutors in the kingdom. Yet the prospect of assuming power now, under these circumstances, filled him with a complicated mixture of duty and dread. The prince's relationship with his father had always been respectful but formal, shaped by the demands of royal protocol and the shadow of his mother's memory. Queen Isabella had died when Alexander was 12, leaving behind a son who idolized her memory and a husband who had grieved deeply before finding love again. When Edmund married Cordelia 7 years later, Alexander had been a young man of 19, already set in his ways, and perhaps unconsciously protective of his mother's legacy. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding thoughts. "Enter," he called, turning to see Lord Reginald Thornwick, one of the most influential members of the noble council and a man Alexander had known since childhood. Lord Thornwick's presence in his chambers could mean only one thing. The political wheels were already turning. "Your Highness," Lord Thornwick said with a deep bow that somehow managed to convey both respect and urgency. "I hope you will forgive the lateness of my visit, but circumstances require immediate discussion." Alexander gestured for the older man to sit, though he remained standing himself, needing the advantage of height and movement to think clearly. "I assume this concerns the letter my father received." "Indeed it does," Lord Thornwick confirmed, his weathered face grave with the weight of what he was about to say. "The noble houses are unified in this matter, Your Highness. We believe the time has come for new leadership, for a return to the traditional values that made Avalonia strong." The words hung in the air like an accusation, though Alexander suspected they were meant as flattery. He had always known that some nobles viewed his father's second marriage with skepticism, but he had not realized how deep their opposition ran until now. "And what exactly are these traditional values?" Alexander asked, his tone carefully neutral. "My father has ruled wisely for 28 years. The kingdom has prospered under his leadership." Lord Thornwick shifted uncomfortably, clearly prepared for resistance, but hoping it would not come from this source. "Your Highness, no one questions your father's past achievements. But the political landscape has changed. Our trading partners have begun to view Avalonia as less stable than it once was. Queen Cordelia's influence over policy decisions has concerned some of our allies." Alexander turned back to the window, using the moment to control his expression. He had never been close to Cordelia, but he had witnessed her intelligence and dedication firsthand. Her initiatives had genuinely improved life for many of Avalonia's citizens, regardless of what the noble houses thought of her common origins. "Specifically, what policies concern our allies?" Alexander pressed, determined to understand whether this opposition was based on legitimate concerns or merely prejudice. Lord Thornwick hesitated before answering. The Queen's trade agreements have favored smaller merchants over established noble houses. Her education programs have raised expectations among the common people that some feel are unrealistic. And her influence over the king in matters of succession and governance has made some question whether decisions are being made in Avalonia's best interests or in service of more personal motivations. The criticism was carefully worded but unmistakably clear. The nobles saw Cordelia as a threat to their traditional power and influence, and they wanted Alexander to be the instrument of their restoration to prominence. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Alexander said, though he already knew the answer. "We need you to support our request that your father step aside and allow you to assume the throne immediately. With your mother's bloodline and your military experience, you represent everything the nobles and our allies value in leadership. The transition would be smooth, and the kingdom would be stronger for it." Alexander felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Every king of Avalonia had faced moments when personal desire conflicted with duty, but few had been asked to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to kingdom in such a stark manner. "And if I refuse to support this request?" he asked. Lord Thornwick's expression grew stern. "Your Highness, the noble houses control significant resources. If we cannot resolve this matter peacefully through proper channels, we may be forced to consider more direct measures to protect the kingdom's interests." The threat was politely phrased but unmistakable. Alexander realized he was not being given a choice so much as being informed of a decision already made by others. The nobles would have their way, with or without his cooperation, but they preferred to have the legitimacy that his support would provide. After Lord Thornwick departed, Alexander remained alone with his thoughts long into the night. He walked through his chambers, past portraits of ancestors who had faced their own impossible choices, past windows that looked out over a kingdom that might soon be his to rule. The prince understood the political realities better than perhaps even the nobles realized. Avalonia's influence had indeed waned in recent years, though he questioned whether Cordelia was truly to blame or merely a convenient scapegoat for larger economic and social changes affecting all the kingdoms in the region. But understanding the politics did not make his choice any easier. Supporting the nobles meant betraying his father's happiness and destroying the life Cordelia had built in Avalonia. Refusing meant risking civil conflict that could devastate the very kingdom he was meant to protect. As dawn broke over the palace, Alexander made his decision. He would meet with his father and lay out the political realities as clearly as possible. Whatever choice Edmund made, it would be made with full knowledge of the consequences. The prince would not be the instrument of anyone's ambition, but neither would he allow his personal feelings to blind him to his duty to the kingdom and its people. The letter that had arrived 3 days earlier had set events in motion that could not be stopped, only guided toward the least destructive conclusion possible. The private family dining room had never felt smaller to King Edmund as he waited for Prince Alexander to arrive for their requested meeting. 2 days had passed since his conversation with Cordelia, 2 days of strained silences and careful politeness that barely concealed the emotional turmoil threatening to tear their marriage apart. She had moved to the guest quarters, claiming she needed space to think, but Edmund knew she was simply making it easier for him to choose duty over love. When Alexander entered the room, Edmund was struck by how much his son resembled Queen Isabella. The strong jawline, the intelligent gray eyes, the way he carried himself with natural authority, all reminders of the woman Edmund had first loved and lost to a fever that had swept through the kingdom 15 years ago. "Father," Alexander said, offering a formal bow before taking the seat across from Edmund at the small round table where the royal family had shared countless meals over the years. "Dispense with the formalities, Alexander," Edmund said wearily. "I know why you're here, and I suspect you know that I know. Let's speak plainly." Alexander nodded, appreciating his father's directness. "Lord Thornwick came to see me. The nobles have made their position clear to me as well. They want your support for their ultimatum, and they want mine." Edmund studied his son's face, looking for clues about where Alexander's loyalties lay. "And what did you tell Lord Thornwick?" "That I would speak with you before making any commitments," Alexander replied carefully. "But, father, we need to discuss the political realities you're facing. The nobles aren't bluffing. They have the resources and the support to make life very difficult for the crown if their demands aren't met." The words hit Edmund like physical blows, even though he had expected them. Hearing his own son acknowledge the noble's power over the throne felt like the final confirmation that his reign was effectively over, regardless of what decision he made about the ultimatum. "So you believe I should step aside?" Edmund said, not quite making it a question. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I believe you should consider what's best for Avalonia, just as you've done throughout your entire reign. The question is whether what's best for the kingdom aligns with what you want for yourself and for Cordelia." Edmund stood and walked to the window, a gesture that had become habitual during these difficult days. Outside, he could see the palace gardens where Cordelia continued to tend her roses, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing something beautiful even as her world crumbled around her. "Do you think I've been a weak king, Alexander?" Edmund asked suddenly. "Do you think marrying Cordelia compromised my judgment or damaged the kingdom?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He had expected to discuss political strategy, not to delve into such personal territory. "I think you've been a king who tried to balance duty with personal happiness," he said finally. "Whether that makes you weak or human is a matter of perspective." Edmund turned back to face his son. "That's a diplomatic answer. I'm asking for your honest opinion." Alexander met his father's gaze directly. "Honestly, I think you've been an effective ruler who made one decision based on love rather than politics. Under normal circumstances, that might not have mattered. But these aren't normal circumstances. The kingdom faces pressures from multiple directions, and the nobles are looking for someone to blame. And they've chosen Cordelia," Edmund said bitterly. "They've chosen to see her as a symbol of everything they think has gone wrong," Alexander corrected. "Whether that's fair or accurate is less important than the fact that it's what they believe." Edmund returned to his seat, suddenly, looking every one of his 62 years. "If I step aside and you take the throne, what happens to Cordelia?" Alexander had been dreading this question because he knew his answer would cause his father pain. "The nobles will expect her to withdraw from public life completely. They won't tolerate her having any influence over policy or governance. She would have to choose between remaining in Avalonia as a private citizen or leaving the kingdom entirely." The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the passage of time that Edmund knew was running out. "And if I refuse the nobles' demands?" Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer. "They'll move against you anyway," Alexander said bluntly. "They have enough support among the military and the merchant class to create real instability. There could be violence, father. People could die." Edmund closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every crown that had been worn by his ancestors. Each king had faced moments of crisis, but few had been forced to choose between personal happiness and the safety of their subjects. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Edmund asked. Alexander considered the question seriously before answering. "I would try to find a solution that preserves as much dignity as possible for everyone involved. But, father, I need you to understand something. If you step aside, I won't rule as the nobles expect me to. I won't simply undo everything you and Cordelia have accomplished. I have my own vision for Avalonia's future." This was the first hint Edmund had received that his son might not be the passive instrument of noble ambitions that he had feared. "What kind of vision?" "One that honors tradition while embracing necessary change," Alexander said. "One that values competence over bloodline, results over privilege. The nobles may think they're getting a return to the old ways, but they're mistaken." Edmund looked at his son with new respect and, perhaps, a glimmer of hope. If Alexander was truly committed to progressive leadership, then stepping aside might not mean abandoning everything Edmund had worked to achieve. "There's something else you need to know," Alexander continued. "I've been conducting my own investigation into the kingdom's finances and trade relationships. Some of the problems the nobles blame on Cordelia actually stem from larger economic changes that no single person could have prevented or solved." "You mean they're using her as a scapegoat?" Edmund said. "Exactly. But that doesn't change the political reality. They have the power to force change, and they're determined to use it." Father and son sat in contemplative silence, each lost in thoughts about duty, family, and the impossible choices that leadership sometimes demanded. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the palace, Queen Cordelia was probably awake as well, waiting to learn the outcome of a conversation that would determine the rest of her life. The throne room of Avalonia Palace had witnessed many historic moments over the centuries, but none quite like the gathering that took place on the morning of King Edmund's decision. Representatives from all the major noble houses had assembled, their silk robes and golden jewelry creating a sea of opulence that contrasted sharply with the somber expressions on their faces. They had come expecting victory, but the tension in the air suggested that nothing about this day would unfold as simply as they had anticipated. King Edmund entered the throne room alone, having specifically requested that both Queen Cordelia and Prince Alexander remain in their private quarters during the announcement. He had spent the previous night in sleepless contemplation, walking the palace corridors and visiting the places that held the most meaning in his reign. The library where he had studied law and governance as a young prince, the portrait gallery where images of his ancestors seemed to watch him with judging eyes, and, finally, the small chapel where he had married Cordelia in a ceremony that had been both the happiest day of his life and, he now realized, the beginning of his political downfall. As Edmund took his place on the throne that had been carved from a single piece of ancient oak 500 years earlier, he surveyed the faces before him. Lord Thornwick stood at the front of the assembly, his expression confident but wary. Behind him, other noble lords and ladies waited with the barely concealed impatience of people who believed they had already won a battle before it was officially declared over. "My lords and ladies," Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the vaulted chamber, "you have presented me with a choice that no king should ever have to make. You have asked me to choose between my personal happiness and the stability of our kingdom, between the woman I love and the people I have sworn to protect." A murmur rippled through the assembly, though whether it represented approval or concern was impossible to determine. "Before I announce my decision," Edmund continued, "I want to address the concerns you have raised about Queen Cordelia's influence over royal policy. You have suggested that her common origins and her initiatives have somehow weakened Avalonia's position among our neighboring kingdoms." Lord Thornwick stepped forward slightly, interpreting the king's words as an invitation to speak. "Your Majesty, we have only sought to preserve the traditions and alliances that have kept Avalonia strong for generations." Edmund held up a hand to silence him. "I have spent these past days investigating your claims, consulting with our ambassadors, and reviewing the economic data that supposedly supports your position. What I have found is enlightening." The confidence in Lord Thornwick's expression began to waver as Edmund's tone took on an edge that suggested uncomfortable revelations were coming. "Our trade relationships remain strong," Edmund announced. "In fact, under Queen Cordelia's guidance, we have established new partnerships that have increased royal revenues by 15% over the past 3 years. Her education programs have created a more skilled workforce that our trading partners specifically value. Her charitable initiatives have prevented social unrest that could have destabilized the kingdom during difficult economic times." The murmur in the room grew louder, and Edmund could see several nobles exchanging concerned glances. They had expected capitulation, not a defense of the Queen's accomplishments. "Furthermore," Edmund continued, "I have discovered that several of the reports claiming our allies view the kingdom as weakened have been, shall we say, embellished by certain parties who hope to advance their own political agendas." Lord Thornwick's face had gone pale, and several other nobles began shifting uncomfortably. They had built their case on a foundation of half-truths and manipulated information, and Edmund was systematically dismantling their argument in front of the entire assembly. "However," Edmund said, and the word hung in the air like a sword about to fall, "I am not naive about the political realities facing our kingdom. I understand that your support is necessary for stable governance, and I recognize that some of you genuinely believe that change is needed." The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the king's final pronouncement. "Therefore," Edmund declared, his voice strong and clear, "I have decided to abdicate the throne, effective immediately, in favor of Prince Alexander." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some nobles cheered, others looked shocked, and a few appeared troubled by the implications of what they had just heard. But Edmund was not finished. "Prince Alexander will assume the crown with my full support and blessing," he continued. "However, I have also decided that Queen Cordelia and I will not be leaving Avalonia. We will be establishing a private residence in the countryside, where we will continue to serve the kingdom through charitable work and diplomatic initiatives, though without any official political authority." Lord Thornwick found his voice. "Your Majesty, the noble houses understood that Queen Cordelia would withdraw from any involvement in kingdom affairs." Edmund's smile was cold and sharp. "The noble houses understood what they chose to understand. I have met your primary demand. I have stepped aside in favor of my son. But I will not abandon my wife or allow her to be driven into exile for the crime of loving a king." The room erupted in angry voices as nobles realized they had achieved only half of what they had sought. They had the traditional monarch they wanted, but they had not eliminated Cordelia's presence from the kingdom entirely. Furthermore, Edmund said, his voice cutting through the noise, "I should inform you that Prince Alexander has already made it clear to me that he intends to govern according to his own principles, not according to the expectations or demands of any particular faction. The noble houses may find that their new king is less malleable than they anticipated." As if summoned by his father's words, Prince Alexander entered the throne room, flanked by royal guards and carrying himself with the bearing of a man ready to assume the weight of leadership. He walked directly to the throne where Edmund sat and knelt before his father in a gesture of respect that was witnessed by every person in the room. "Rise, my son," Edmund said formally. "Rise, King Alexander of Avalonia." As Alexander stood and accepted the crown from his father's hands, the assembled nobles realized that they had won a hollow victory. They had forced one king from power only to elevate another who might prove even more challenging to their traditional authority. In the weeks that followed, the transition of power proceeded more smoothly than anyone had expected. King Alexander proved to be a capable and decisive leader who honored many of his father's policies while implementing his own vision for Avalonia's future. The noble houses found themselves dealing with a monarch who was respectful of tradition but not bound by it, who listened to their counsel but made his own decisions. Edmund and Cordelia settled into their new life with a grace that surprised many who had expected bitterness and recrimination. Their love, tested by political fire, had emerged stronger and more resilient. Free from the constraints of royal protocol, they found a happiness in their rural retreat that had sometimes been difficult to achieve in the palace. The letter that had arrived on that fateful morning had indeed altered the palace and changed the course of Avalonia's history. But it had not achieved what its authors had intended. Instead of destroying love and restoring old ways, it had created a new form of leadership that honored both tradition and progress, both duty and personal happiness. Years later, historians would write about the peaceful transition of power that had preserved the kingdom's stability while advancing its principles of justice and equality. They would note how a crisis that could have led to civil war had instead strengthened the monarchy and created a new model for royal governance. And in a small cottage surrounded by gardens where roses bloomed in every season, a former king and queen would read those histories and smile, knowing that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from holding on to power, but from knowing when and how to let it go.